Hello everyone, welcome to Computer Science E75. I'm Dan Armendariz, the head TF for this course, and I will be giving today's lecture on Ajax. But before we dive into some of the topics related to Ajax, I thought I would first mention that, the final project specifications have actually been released. So if you go to the course website, you can go to the project section of the web page or of the website and download the spec for the final project. Now, the final project itself, it doesn't have very many stringent requirements. In other words, you're really free here to pick what you want to do for your final project, but you do have some restrictions, and those are given in the PDF. As you can see, you have to use some of the technologies that we've discussed throughout this semester, like PHP, MySQL, JavaScript, but you don't have to necessarily use all of them. It should work on a number of browsers, not just one, so on and so forth. And you can decide what you want to do for your final project, and as soon as you have decided, you should send us a proposal. There's a link near the bottom of the PDF to the proposal, and you can submit your proposal there. So once you submit the proposal, your TF will look at it and will approve or will suggest that perhaps it might need a little bit of reining in because it's too ambitious, or maybe it needs a little bit of fleshing out because it's not quite ambitious enough. And as soon as you get the OK from your TF, you may proceed. Now, the first deadline that you have to be concerned with for the final project is, in fact, the proposal. And let's see, it's released today, and you have 2 weeks to do the proposal. So by Monday, November 15th, should you submit your proposal to us. And we cannot accept final projects that have not submitted a proposal, so be sure that you do it. Even if it's a little bit late, submit the proposal. You absolutely must do that before you submit the final project. Now, at the end of the term, when the final project is due, we will actually be having a computer science fair on December 14th that will be held jointly with Computer Science E7 Exposing Digital Photography, my other class, and it will be a fun way of demonstrating your web projects to not only your peers in this class, but also some of your peers in the other class as well. And there will be cake, and friends are invited, and it's all around a generally pretty good time. So we hope you will attend for that as well. Now, with that in mind, before we can really start to get into thinking about your final project, one of the reasons that you might be in this course is because of Ajax. And Ajax is this technology that's really a culmination of many of the technologies that we've seen in this class up until now, that gives us this additional feature set on web pages that provide an extra amount of dynamism. So in other words, what you've seen up until now is that you can go to a web page. On the server side, it can either be a completely flat text file, or it can be generated by a PHP script, for example, and then that data is sent to the client, and that's pretty much it. That's what you get to see. And yes, you saw JavaScript last week where you can actually make some changes on the client side, but using Ajax, can you actually combine the two? And there's actually a pretty good demonstration of what Ajax actually is in excuse me, in the very popular web application Google Maps. So Google Maps is in fact an Ajax application, and one of the reasons that you know this is that whenever you manipulate the map, it doesn't require a refresh of the page. And this was sort of a big thing when it came out some years ago, where previous map implementations were very, very static. And you would be shown a map, and if you wanted to scroll on that map, you would have a whole bunch of arrows on the side of the map. You would click one of those arrows, and then the whole page would reload as it fetches the new images that make up this map. But with Google Maps, they use Ajax to fetch the data live as you are strolling, or as you're scrolling around within the web page, so that you don't have to refresh the page every time you want to do that. And so that's essentially what this is. It allows us to perform additional requests, additional HTTP requests from a web page, and retrieve or change the information that is shown on the current page without having to refresh it. And this is sort of a big deal, and arguably one of the reasons why so many websites are like they are today. So many web applications do in fact use Ajax to load data live. Twitter, for example, Facebook, any of these social applications, they love to use Ajax to load new feeds, new data that they can show you as quickly as possible. And all of this is made possible through Ajax. And so before we can really start getting into the nitty-gritty of Ajax, it's important to realize something important about the way that a browser interprets an HTML page. And in other words, an HTML page is provided in memory, or it's created in memory in the web browser in this document object model. So it takes this markup language, it takes this HTML, and it basically creates a big document object out of it. And this document object is made up of a hierarchy, like a tree. The root of this tree is the document itself, and then the children of that tree are the elements that exist within this markup language. So, for example, we have you can see the root of this tree here is the document. The root element is, in fact, the HTML element. That's the first element that we have that encapsulates other elements within this HTML page. Then after that, we have two children to HTML. We have the head tag and also the body tag. Notice that they are, in fact, siblings because they're direct descendants of the HTML element. Then from there, we have further children and so on and so forth, and you can see all of this further information, or how this tree is essentially formed in memory, representing the document in an object. And so what this allows us to do is that in JavaScript, we can actually modify the document object model to make some changes to a page. And in fact, you did see that, hopefully, last week in one of the examples that David went over in this javascript.html. And this javascript.html file really it's very basic JavaScript implementation, but it really does show that we can modify a web page on the client side with JavaScript. So just by using the document, and recognize that this document object is exactly what we were talking about. This is that object that I was just referring to, the DOM, the document object model. This is that object right there, right here. Document has within it a method called write. And we can access this method to just write some text directly into the document wherever this JavaScript happens to be. So this is just a very basic example of how we can use the document object model to modify a web page. And this is going to be very useful for us because using Ajax, we're going to be requesting some data from somewhere else. And we're going to be retrieving this data from a server after this page is already loaded. And we need some way of injecting that data that we received into the web page. And that's precisely what this DOM allows us to do. So with the DOM, you can actually have a variety of methods and fields. There's a whole bunch of references online that I'd refer you to if you want to find out some more information, find out some more of the methods that are available, find out how you can access children directly. We're not going to have time to really go into a lot of the specifics about this, but certainly there's a lot of resources online for you to find out more. So there's these resources available, and there is many years ago, actually now about, 14, 15 years ago or so, did Microsoft in their Internet Explorer web browser actually create a new object that allows us to modify the DOM, but allow us to retrieve information from somewhere else. From using some HTTP connection, we can retrieve information back from the server. And so they really created what we now call Ajax. And Ajax, by the way, used to stand for asynchronous JavaScript and XML. But nowadays, it doesn't necessarily have to be asynchronous. You don't necessarily have to use JavaScript, and it doesn't necessarily have to be XML. So really, it's not an acronym anymore. It's just representative of what we're doing. And what we're doing is dynamically changing or modifying the HTML that the client has on their web browser. So Internet Explorer was first with Ajax, and they created an ActiveX object called XML HTTP request. And eventually, all the other web browsers followed suit, but they made this a JavaScript object called XML HTTP request object. And I know there's a bit of history here, but there's a reason that I'm telling you this, and that is that when I actually show you how we create an instance of this XML HTTP request object, it's not a simple one-liner. Because we have to take into account all of the different browsers and all of the different ways that they actually create this object, we actually have some work cut out for us to create one instance of the XML HTTP request object. So the whole point of this is that, yes, it's pretty much standardized as being called this XML HTTP request object, but still the implementation from browser to browser is ever so slightly different. And this is one of the ways that cross-browser implementation really starts to become sort of a pain in our neck. So what this allows us to do is, using this object, we can make HTTP requests without changing the page. So in JavaScript, we can ask this object to actually perform another HTTP request, get some more information from another web page, for example, and when we retrieve that information back, we can decide to do something with it. We can inject it into the HTML using the DOM. We could display an alert with information if we wanted. Anything that we could do with JavaScript, we would be able to do with this. And the first A, like I mentioned in Ajax, stands for asynchronous, which means that you can actually perform multiple requests at once, or rather, once you perform a request, it doesn't block the entire web browser from continuing to function. If it was a synchronous request, that means that that request would have to go to the server, and the client would wait for the reply from the server before continuing with the processing. And that could make the page appear a little bit slow. Even if you have a fast server, there's a slight delay for that, and that might cause the page to appear to be a little bit slow. So this asynchronicity is really a big advantage when it comes to using Ajax. Now, this XML HTTP request object has available to it a number of methods. And I'm just going through some of these slides relatively quickly before we start diving into the code itself. But just to give you an idea of some of the methods that we have available to us through this object, we have these. So let's see. So abort, for example, you can pretty much guess what that does. That would probably cancel the current request. Get all response headers. So as you know, whenever you perform an HTTP request, you're sending headers to the server, and the server is replying with a certain set of headers. You can actually fetch that header information using Ajax if you wanted to. You can, using the open method, this is actually what provides the specifics of a request. For example, if you're going to be doing a get query or a post query, what the URL is going to be of the page that you want to retrieve data from. Send actually sends the data to the server. It actually issues this Ajax request to the URL that you specified in open. And let's see, set request header. We could actually set some headers if we wanted here. OK, so I know this was a lot of information at first. So let's just take a look at a very basic example of what Ajax might look like. And to do that, we have a very simple ajax1.html. And it's just this. This is an HTML file. You can see it's fully loaded on my web browser. It's not pending any information or anything like that. And you'll notice that it's just a form. Symbol, it's asking me for a symbol, that, like a stock symbol that I can enter. And when I hit get quote, it will actually fetch the price from a server. It will fetch the price from the server, and then it will notify me of what the price actually is. So let's try a couple. For example, Microsoft, MSFT. I type in the symbol, I hit get quote, and I wait a little bit. Now you notice that the page didn't actually reload, but after a moment or two, we had an alert box pop up, and it gives us exactly the data that we requested. In this case, the price of Microsoft is $26.95. Now we can do just a few others. Apple, for example. APL, just to show you how this works. Okay, so now they're getting ridiculous at 300. And just one more, Google. Let's see, whoops, I hit it twice. And you can see now that Google is also ridiculously overvalued at $615. Okay, so how does all of this work? Well, we obviously have to be able to use this XML HTTP request object, but how do we know what to do with this? Well, keep in mind that initially what we did was we just had this very basic form. There's nothing special about this form, really, except that it calls a JavaScript function when we hit submit. So notice that we have a form here, and we ask using this input ID, or using this input type text. We're calling it, giving it a name of symbol. And whenever we hit submit, notice that on submit, we're going to be calling the JavaScript function called quote. So what we're doing is, it's essentially, you can think of this as being sort of a fancy validation from last week, where you would pass the data from the form to a validation function. This function would handle all of the data and decide if it would actually allow you to submit the form or not. But in this case, we're never going to allow the form to be submitted, because we don't want to go to the subsequent page. We don't actually want to post this data to quote1.php. What we want to do is to get this information through JavaScript and just have JavaScript handle all of this information for us. So typically, so that's why you see after quote, return false. We don't ever want to actually submit this form. If we didn't have this return false, what would happen? Right, it would try to submit whatever we entered into this quote1.php, which means that it's going to actually be fetching another page, and that's against the whole point of what we're trying to do. So we're just aborting the normal form function in this case by having this return false. So okay, so there must be something special about this quote function. So if we take a look at quote right here, we'll notice that it actually looks a little bit long, but there's only a few parts to it, really. The first part, we have to instantiate this XML HTTP request object. And remember that I mentioned that this object can be instantiated a number of different ways depending on the web browser that you're using to view this page. So, for example, if I want to use, let's see, Internet Explorer, I would probably use the ActiveX object. So I would use this XHR equals new ActiveX object, Microsoft.xml HTTP. If I was using another browser like Firefox or Safari, it would probably support the other type, XHR equals new XML HTTP request object. This is the JavaScript style instantiation of this object. So this is why we have these two lines around the try catch block. So we're going to try first to instantiate this XML HTTP request object using the typical JavaScript format. So right here, what's highlighted right now, XHR equals new XML HTTP request. Now, if that fails for some reason, JavaScript will essentially throw an exception, like a Java-style exception, if you're familiar. And we have a catch block. So we're catching this exception. Rather than actually allowing JavaScript to cause an error, if it's not possible to create this new XML HTTP request object, we'll catch the error and we'll try it again using this ActiveX method, which will probably allow this to work on most Internet Explorer web browsers. Now, this actually is not a complete implementation of the various ways that you can instantiate an XML HTTP request object. There's actually several. I think it's 4 or 5. You basically have these several nested try-catch blocks as you continue to try different methods of instantiating an object. But this, frankly, captures the majority of the web browsers that we want. Firefox, Safari, Chrome, Internet Explorer, the latest version of all of those, this will function for. But the older ones, it's sort of a crapshoot with this code. So there's, if you want to find out how to use this, I mean, there's resources available online, but also we'll show you a way at the end of the lecture how you can use some libraries that will actually perform all of these try-catch blocks for you, and you don't have to worry about it. But for now, this is the nitty-gritty way of doing this, and nitty-gritty sort of basic way at the same time. Okay, so assuming that we haven't actually failed at either of these cases, and we're actually going to perform the test, we will see if for some reason our browser does not support this XML HTTP request object. So if this object, XHR, is null, then that means that we had a problem instantiating it, and we should probably notify the user that the web page is not going to behave as they expect. So in this case, we'll just show a simple alert saying Ajax isn't supported by your web browser and will return false. There's no reason for us to continue processing at that point. But assuming that we do have an object instantiated in this variable, now we can actually perform the request that we want. So first things first, we need to construct the URL that we want to retrieve the data from. So we've created a new variable called URL, and we're just concatenating in the information that we typed into the form into this string. So we have here var URL. Notice that we're referencing quote1.php. So this assumes that there is a PHP file on the server in the same relative path as this HTML file. So notice that the URL of this web page is docs.danallen.net/e75/lectures/7. So presumably there is a quote1.php file in that same directory that is going to be doing this. This is a relative, it works just like other relative HTML paths. This is a relative path to that PHP file. Now we're going to pass it just using a standard get query style some information. And in this case, we will pass it the symbol information from the form. So we do question mark symbol equals, and then we find the value of the form element. So in this case, document.getElementById symbol.value. And this will actually fetch the value that the user typed in to that form field that we saw in the HTML page, HTML portion of the page. Okay, so now we have formed our URL. All right, so now we actually want to get the quote. So we have to open up a connection in the XML HTTP request object. So that's what we do. Let's see, we do xhr.open using get. We pass it the URL, and true, generally this last parameter will always be true. This is whether or not you want it to be asynchronous. Now, unless you have a really good reason that you want it to be synchronous and lose the asynchronicity, you probably should just keep this true almost all the time. Okay, but notice that right before we opened it, we did something. We also set this other field up called xhr on ready state change equal to handler. Now notice that handler is actually a function that exists down here. Now this handler function will be called by the XML HTTP request object whenever the state changes, whenever it first sends the data, whenever it gets an acknowledgement from the server, whenever the data is returned from the server, whenever it has parsed the information. Anytime the state has changed in this entire request, it will call this handler function that I've defined elsewhere. Now, because JavaScript is the way it is, you could actually make this into an anonymous function where in other words, you can just make this equal to a function and then have all of the code in there. But typically, this handler function will be sort of lengthy because it has to deal with the different states that you want to deal with. And so we'll have a separate function for that, call it handler, and we'll just tell when the ready state has changed that we want to call this handler function. Okay, so now the XML HTTP request object knows where to send the data. It knows what data to send it. It knows what sort, to use the get query rather than a post query. And it knows also, as soon as that request is completed, what to do. It's going to run this handler function. So at this point, we're ready to send the data. So we do xhr.send. And at this point, this is when the data is actually sent over to quote1.php. Now, I'm not going to show you quote1.php quite yet, but I want to show you handler. And handler is something that runs whenever, like I mentioned before, whenever the state has changed, there's going to be something, there has to be something that's run. And in this case, we're only handling one state. Whenever the XML HTTP request object has met a state of 4, that means that it's completely loaded the request. And assuming that we got an HTTP response of 200, meaning that all is okay, it's not a 403 permissions error, it's not a 404 file not found, nothing like that. Assuming we actually properly found the file and that file has given us data back, we're going to do something. And in this case, we're going to alert the response text. So in this case, notice that the XHR object contains whatever was responded from this PHP file in this response text field, which is really nice because now we have access to whatever was sent back from this quote1.php file. And we're just going to use a very simple alert to show what happened. And if I had some other problem, if I had a problem like quote1 doesn't exist, or maybe quote1 had the incorrect permissions, I would probably get some other error. I would get a status other than 200, and I would get this error with Ajax call. Now, there are a variety of different states that can happen. So for example, you'll notice that we tested two things. First, we tested the ready state. And in this handler function, we only cared about, at least for this simple example, we only cared about the state when it was completely loaded. But you can also do other things as well. Whenever it starts receiving data, you can have some function be run or some statement be performed. Or whenever you've actually sent the data, then it can do something. So you might imagine that there might be some way that we can notify the user when their request is being processed by using these different ready state changes. And so keep that in mind. We'll come back to that in just a little bit. Notice again the status, this is an actual HTTP status, so it's all the same status numbers that you would expect, like 200 OK, 404 not found, 500 server error, so on and so forth. You can actually find the HTTP status, which is useful for debugging and also error checking, as you saw in this case as well. Now there are a variety of other fields where the data is actually placed, including the response text, response XML if the return type is XML, response body for IE only. There's a couple other ones as well, and we'll look at some of those. But just to show you, there's a whole bunch of information that is provided to us by this XML HTTP request object. Okay, so let's take a look now at quote1.php and see what's going on at this end of the spectrum. So this PHP file is not difficult at all, really. All it is this. It retrieves, because we sent in this information using the symbol get query, we know the symbol information, and so we can just do a standard lookup, and we can just do a standard lookup from Yahoo, like you're probably hopefully used to by now for CS75 Finance. So we can get the information from Yahoo Finance, and assuming that all goes well, we can actually print out the data. So keep in mind that this PHP file doesn't print out an entire HTML page. All it's printing out is just the number. It's just finding the information, the price information for that symbol that we've entered, and it's just printing that out. It's basically acting as a middleman. So the question is, why did we not, using Ajax, why didn't we not fetch the data from Yahoo directly? Any ideas? Why did we have to use this middleman?
Is it kind of like hot linking? Is it impolite to send your users directly to?
So that's a good guess. So it's more than impolite. It's actually a security risk. It's actually there's this idea called the same origin policy, where you can only get information using Ajax from the same domain that the web page actually exists. And the reason for this is that if you try to fetch information from some other untrusted domain, what can happen is that this person might realize it and start sending you bad data, intentionally bad data, and ruining your and essentially ruining the security of your web page, because then you are allowing untrusted data to enter into the HTML of your page and into the JavaScript of your page, and depending on the complexity of your web page, this could be a very, very bad thing. For this right here, it maybe doesn't matter so much. We would be opening ourselves up to some cross-site scripting attacks and that sort of stuff, but it's still a significant problem. So due to same origin policy, if you are trying to implement an Ajax request, and let's say you're working on your computer at home and you have this HTML page loaded up on your web browser at home, but this HTML page is hosted on your home computer, whether you're using XAMPP or you just double-clicked on the HTML file or what have you, but you're using a URL that refers to your domain on the cloud, realize that this is not going to work because those two domains don't match. These two files have to be on the same domain. So in other words, you can have it if both quote.php and this ajax1.html were both on your XAMPP installation, or were both on your home server, or they're both on the same server, but it's not going to work if you load up ajax.html that's on one server, and in that HTML you reference the quote.php file on a different server entirely. So just beware of this downfall of Ajax. This is something that can actually impact your development time quite a bit. Certainly it can be really frustrating if you can't figure out why this Ajax request isn't performing the way it should. Okay, but basically this is just a very basic HTML file. So let's see what happens if I just run quote1.php by itself. Now nothing, obviously, but if I pass it a symbol, like we had seen before, I get back the information. This is the only information that this PHP file gets. Now, or that this PHP file outputs, rather. And the reason for this is that we don't normally visit this PHP file just by itself. We usually see this through the context of ajax.html, which is actually performing the request. It gets this data, it gets this data back from the PHP file, and it retrieves it, and it does something with it. And in this case, we just did a very basic alert box, but that's sufficient for this, just for this example. So it's important to realize what's going on here. So just to show you one more example, let's see. So if we go back to ajax1.html, I think it'll be useful to show you what happens with HTTP headers. So right now, I have loaded up ajax1.html and I've opened up HTTP headers, you can see that right now there's no HTTP requests happening in this web browser. But as soon as I enter a symbol and hit return, what we will expect is that this will perform an HTTP request back to the server to quote1.php, fetch the data back, and that will be the end of it. So let's do this. I'll click get quote. I get the data back, and if I look at the HTTP headers, we can see that that's exactly what happened. This has actually performed an HTTP request in the background without us having reloaded the page. And this is the power of Ajax. And essentially, this is all it boils down to. Now, from here, it's refinement. It's using different methods, different pass-back methods of data so that we can do different things with this data. It's passing back more than one piece of data at a time. But essentially, this is what Ajax boils down to, is this right here, is that we can perform HTTP requests in the background from this web page. And if I scroll down, you'll see, OK, I get back from this quote.php page, HTTP 200 OK, content type text HTML, and it's the actual data involved with this as well. OK, any questions on this before we move on? Now, using an alert box, as you know, is not the best, most user-friendly way of showing them data. Like, this web page would probably get a bit annoying after a while if the user had to submit themselves to using an alert box this entire time. And this is what Ajax 2 tries to do instead. So in this case, what we want to do is a similar thing where we still fetch the data from quote.php, but this time we're going to actually insert it into the DOM itself. So in this case, I'll type in a symbol, hit get quote, and you'll see that now instead of an alert box, this data is being inserted into another form field. So how does this work? Well, we can imagine that the quote function in JavaScript is largely the same to what we saw before, but what is probably different is the handler function. When this handler function receives the data back, it probably is doing something a little bit different from what we saw in Ajax 1. So if we look at the source, this is exactly what we see. We see that we have the quote function, and it's pretty much exactly the same like we saw before. We create the URL to quote 1. We make sure that we set the callback function to handler. We open the connection to this URL and we send the data. Then in the handler, this is where we do something a little bit different. Notice that in this case, we're actually modifying the DOM. We're going to the document, we're finding the element called price, or that has an ID called price, and we're setting its value equal to whatever data we just received back from the Ajax request. So in this case, we're setting the value equal to the xhr.response text. And this is already a cleaner way of presenting this information. It's a little bit more complicated just because we can't use the nice alert function, but this is certainly a better way. Now, obviously, we had to have created this HTML element called price, but that's a trivial thing to do. You just create this form field, and you give it an ID called price, and that's it. OK, moving on. Any questions about this? OK, now this is an even nicer way, perhaps, of doing this same thing. So rather than having another form field, which looks at first glance like it's something that we should edit, and in fact, I think I accidentally clicked in the price field first on accident when I showed you Ajax 2, this is something that will be a little bit more Ajax-like. In other words, we are actually now going to be modifying the HTML of the page itself. So I'll type in a symbol, I'll get the quote, and we see that the price, that there is this text that said to be determined, that has actually been replaced with the result of this Ajax request. And to do this, you can imagine it's the same thing for quote, but what changes again is that we have this, let's see, we basically have this, we're finding this element with an ID of price, and we're modifying its inner HTML to be equal to the data that we just got back. Now realize that this example is very, very simplistic. You should be a little bit concerned about the security of what's going on here. So you should be absolutely sure that the data that you're getting back is well formed, that it's HTML that will be well formed, that can be injected into a web page safely, and that it's not actually going to contain some other JavaScript that might be malicious for some users. But this is something that would increase the complexity of this example. And this is also something that you can take care of on the server side as well. You can make sure that as long as your PHP file is very stringent about what it sends back, you can at least be a little bit safer in the security of this request. Yes?
What is inner HTML on this page? Is that the ID of some element on the page that you just told to update it?
So inner HTML is a method that's available through a DOM. So in this case, we actually had in HTML a span ID, an element that is a span. And many elements like A elements, div elements, span elements, when you give them an ID, you can actually modify the contents within that element using the inner HTML. So what's happening here is that we have an element called span, and it has, as a child, some HTML to it. So this is some HTML that's something like in bold, to be determined, TBD, so on and so forth. And when we use this inner HTML method, what we are doing is we are essentially changing what is inside here to reflect whatever it is that we got back. So in this case, we just got back a number, which was 26 dot something. And that's all that's happening here, is that we're essentially just changing, and thinking of this a little bit more simply, we're essentially just changing this text. This text is the inner HTML. It is the HTML that is within this element, and we're modifying it to be whatever we got back from the request.
So you lost the bold.
We lost, yeah, that's why, yep, we did lose the bold. And that's why it looks like it does. When we first loaded the page, you can see it says, excuse me, to be determined in bold. When I hit get quote, and the data that's sent back has lost its bold. Yes?
You mentioned that it's a security risk to be dynamically replacing the HTML. Why? Like, if you're the person that is running the website, why would it be a security? Like, can other people inject stuff like that? How do you do that?
So why is it a security risk that we're modifying the HTML? So you can be reasonably sure that the PHP file that you're requesting is your own, just because you are maintaining this web server, you know the contents of this PHP file. But this PHP file is in fact fetching data from somewhere else. And we didn't perform any checks on the price that was given back. So what if some really nasty web programmer at Yahoo decides, he watches this video, he knows what we're doing, and he decides to change all of the prices in the CSV to be something that looks like this. So script type equals JavaScript, so on and so forth. And then he actually has some code in here that does something bad. And in this case, what could be bad is something like it passes to him the cookie ID for your web page. So whereas normally you wouldn't be able to access, or somebody on another domain wouldn't be able to access any cookies that we have on this web page, he could, by injecting a JavaScript into the web page, he could actually get that data sent elsewhere. And this would be a bad thing. And this, in fact, is called a cross-site scripting attack. And it's something it's considered one of the top 5 or so security threats on the internet. It's this and another one. And we'll talk more about what these are and how to combat them in the security lecture. But it's still something to be mindful of. No.
So just to clarify, the weakness isn't between your server and the user. It's between your server and the server that you're requesting.
Right. In this case, it's not. The weakness isn't. Well, there's always a weakness between the client and the server, but beyond those sort of obvious attacks, man in the middle, and that sort of thing, even if we're reasonably sure that the PHP file on our server is going to be correct, we are still pulling data from elsewhere, and that data we should consider to be untrusted. So we're still just getting data from an untrusted source. Even if it's Yahoo, we still have to consider anything that is not our own to be untrusted, and we have to combat this accordingly. So I mean, one of the ways that we could fix this, how could we fix this? How could we ensure that the price that we're getting doesn't have something like a script tag within it?
Use HTML special char, do some kind of validation to make sure there only contains one element.
Right, exactly. So there's PHP functions available that will, like strip tags, that will actually strip out HTML and PHP tags out of text. You could use HTML special chars if you actually wanted to preserve the look of this. If you wanted to treat this as a literal text and actually display it on the page, you could use that to actually display this rather than embed it as actual HTML. There's a variety of ways that you can try to combat this. And again, we'll talk more about this in the security lecture. Okay. Any other questions before we move on? All right, so now, excuse me. Now, getting just one piece of information is nice, but it doesn't show us the power of Ajax. When one of the things that Ajax can do is give us a lot of information at once. So what if we wanted to get more than just the price for this one symbol? And in this case, what I also want to see is the low price and the high price information that Yahoo has available for this symbol as well. So this is going to be Ajax 4, and this one we're now going to have to use a different quote.php file just because quote1.php only provided to us the price for that symbol. So obviously if we want to fetch more information, we're going to have to modify this file in some way. So we have through ajax4.html, it fetches data from Ajax, or rather quote2, and what we see if I try to get this information is that I get more than just the price. I also get the high information for the day and the low information as well. Now you'll notice that I just inserted this information into a text area, and this should be relatively familiar based on what we saw in one of the Ajax examples just a moment ago. But in this case, we just have a text area that we've called result, and in our handler function, we want to set the value of that result element to the response text that we get back from the request to our quote PHP file. And you'll notice that we have actually for once changed our quote function, and in this case we're using a different URL entirely. We're using quote2.php rather than quote1. So in this way we can get some other information. So you might imagine that quote2 is just a little bit different from quote1 in that it presents to us more than one piece of information, and that's precisely what happens. So in quote2 we can see that we get not only the price information, but we're also printing out the high and the low information as well. And just because all this thing is doing is just giving us raw text with the information that we want to inject into our web page, there's not much that we have to do in the way of formatting this text or doing anything like that. As soon as we get the result of this query, which we can see here, we can just take this text, and this is the text that's provided to us by quote2, and just insert it into the DOM like we saw. Okay. Now, moving on, let's see, to Ajax 5. All right, so this is pretty much the same thing, but again, we're going to use the better method of putting it into just the raw HTML elements rather than into a form field, which might be a little bit confusing, and it's certainly suboptimal. So in this case, I'll do another symbol, type it in here, and hopefully this won't take too long, and you'll see that we get this back as a result. Now there is actually a little bit of a change to this one, and that is that what would happen if I used the result of quote2.php, which we saw before, and I inserted this information directly into an HTTP object, or rather an HTML object. So keep in mind that this is exactly what's being returned. So how would this look if I used quote2 in this better HTML object, or rather HTML element, rather than putting it into a text area? How would it be different? Right, so this is the same thing that you know with HTML. Unless we have line breaks, this information is not going to be broken into lines. So if I modified that Ajax file, and this was what, Ajax 5, I think? If I modified Ajax 5 to use quote2 rather than quote3, what we would see is that all of this information runs together. And in fact, this is something that we can test. Let's see. So I mentioned that it was in quote5.php. Oh no, not quote5.php. It was Ajax 5.html. And what we see here is, let's see, it was quote, it's not using, which quote is it using? quote 3, yes, I wanted to use quote 2. So now I'm using quote 2 in this case. And if I go back and reload this page and I give it a symbol, it's now going to fetch the data from quote 2, and we can see what is going to happen. It all runs together just like we predicted. So what we have to change then is to actually insert BR tags or line breaks so that we can actually break this apart into different lines, because essentially all we're doing is inserting HTML into this web page. And so that is precisely what quote 3 does. Nope. Quote 3. And we'll see what happens here. Now we can see we have line breaks. And if we actually take a look at what quote 3 looks like, we can see that this, in fact, does exactly what we were saying. It actually prints out line breaks for us, and so that we can format it nicely for this web page. OK, moving on. Let's see, quote 6 here. Now, what is nice about this one is that we have a little bit more information that's provided to us. So whereas before, I mentioned that we have these different ready state changes, or these different ready states, rather, that change depending on the status of this request that we've been sending to the server. And this is precisely what we can take advantage of when we are trying to fetch information. So whereas before, you saw that there was sort of this delay, and we were trying to figure out what's going on. Why is it taking so long? There's no feedback back to the user that provides some information that says, OK, just be patient a little while longer. I'm getting the information for you. I'll load it, and I'll show it to you here as soon as I possibly can. So somehow, we are modifying the DOM two different ways. First, as soon as we start fetching the data, we tell the user that we're looking up the information. Then when we actually retrieve the data, do we tell the user what that data actually is. So in this case, we can imagine that we have to deal with the different states in the XML HTTP request object. And rather than just dealing with the final state, the one where all of the data has been loaded, perhaps we want to do something where as soon as the data has been sent, we want to tell the user that something has happened. Let's see. So here we can do this. And I mean, this can be done very simply. As soon as we create, and before we even send the information to the user, can we tell them, OK, well, here we go. I'm about to send the data to the user, so I might as well just notify them by modifying the HTML of this HTML element to tell the user that there is data that is being loaded. And that's essentially all that is happening in this one here. OK. Now, moving on to Ajax 7. And this one is actually pretty neat, I think, because now, rather than actually using some text, we can use some fancy little spinny thing and show the user that something is happening. Yes, there is something going on in the background, and to continue being patient while we do this. And so you might have noticed that in the list of files, one of the things we had was just a GIF file that was present along with the other files that exist for Ajax and quote. And this GIF file is just an animated GIF that shows us that it's loading. And this is all it is. And so as soon as we show the user this GIF, then it will appear as though something is happening. It will appear as though this thing is loading. And so that's precisely what we do in this file. Ajax 7. That's precisely what we do in this case, is we show the animated GIF as the data is being sent. So what's happening here is that now, instead, what we are doing is we are changing, let's see, we have added some additional elements to our HTML. Notice that we have added an image element. And in this case, this image element is going to load the GIF. And this is useful to have in the HTML, because even though this may not be visible at the onset, as soon as the page is loaded, the web browser will still load the image into memory, and it will be instantaneous. As soon as you show it, it will appear to the user as though something is actually happening, rather than the user having to wait for this GIF file to be downloaded while it's being displayed. That's a whole mess that we don't want to have to deal with. So in this case, we're just going to have within this div, and notice that we have changed the display style to none, which means that it's just not visible. So it is loaded in the DOM, and there is this animated GIF that's sort of spinning ad nauseum in the background, but it's not visible in this HTML file until we change, or until we get the quote, in which case we modify the style of the element to be a block. So that's one of the nice things about the DOM as well, is that you can modify not only the HTML of this object, but you can also modify the CSS, or rather the style of this element as well. So whereas before we had the display style set to none, in this case we can change it back to the block style and actually show this, this animated GIF as it spins around. And the other thing we want to do is, let's see, we want to hide this other, let's see, we had, no, did we? I don't think we did, never mind. Okay, no, so we had this, we hit get quote, and after a loading symbol, we're actually showing you this. Now, you might be wondering, well, why does this loading symbol show for so long? And in fact, this was something that we did intentionally, just because occasionally the server can actually respond very, very quickly to our request. So what we did in quote 4 was in fact introduce an artificial delay into the response, just to be able to show you this loading thing. So in this case, it's pretty much the same as quote 3, except that we're having the PHP script stall execution for about 5 seconds. So because this script is going to take at least 5 seconds to process, we have 5 seconds of time that we can view this loading thing. Now, this is not something that you would typically do. Obviously, you want to send the data back as quickly as possible, but this shows you that because it's asynchronous, the browser was still able to show us this spinning animated GIF rather than having to wait for the response from the server before we could continue doing anything else. And so this is not something you would typically do unless you really wanted to artificially inflate the amount of time that somebody would get back data from your server. But this is just used as a way of showing you, as an opportunity to show you how we can use this loading animated GIF to make the experience slightly more bearable for our impatient users. Okay, let's take a 5-minute break, and when we come back, we'll continue talking about Ajax. All right, welcome back, everybody. So before the break, we were looking at Ajax. And I mentioned also early on that there's more than just one way of sending data. So perhaps you want to do more than just send data in HTML format. Maybe it makes a lot more sense to send this data in another format like, say, XML. And this is certainly possible, and this is in fact one of the primary reasons why Ajax was originally created. In fact, that's what the X in Ajax stands for, was XML. And this is one of the reasons why we might use Ajax to our benefit. So in the subsequent, let's see, in the next source code, oh boy, this is going to be interesting. I have to bring it back up 1 second. What we have is we have something that looks very similar to what we've seen already, but in fact works very differently. So in Ajax 8, notice that we have some predefined sections within, some predefined elements within this HTML page that just define the low, the high, and the price of the symbol that we want to see. So as soon as I enter a symbol and I hit enter, we find that this data is populated where we want it to be. So this implies that we're getting data not just in a straight XHTML format that we're then placing by modifying the inner HTML of a specific element, but maybe we're getting this in some different way. So if we actually take a look at the corresponding quote file that this happens to be using, which is quote5.php, notice that already is this very, very different. In fact, in quote5.php, are we changing the content type to XML? Because what we are going to be doing is sending back an XML file, essentially, back to this Ajax, or to this Ajax request. And what we will do is we will then parse this XML data and do something with it. So notice that we are just outputting just a sort of a standard XML file that shows a variety of information like the symbol name. It also gives us the price, the high, the low, and it should close all of the elements appropriately. So if I were to actually visit quote5.php and provide to it some information, we would see that it should be in XML form. And in fact, you can already see that. Just providing it the symbol of AAPL, we can see that we get back this XML file. Yes?
I noticed that you did several print commands.
Mm-hmm.
Is there any benefit to getting everything, composing one print command, and just doing
Well, certainly. I mean, there's benefits. If you have more than 3, then it becomes probably beneficial to use a little bit more efficient of a means. Again, this is meant to demonstrate this idea very easily rather than trying to show you the most efficient code. But yes, it is a good point that we might have an array of data. So we might want more than the price, the low and the high. We might want some of the other information that's available from Yahoo as well. And we could then have maybe an associative array, for example, that matches the price to the element number that we would get back. And we could very easily construct just with one print line for each loop that iterates over all of the data that we've gotten back with this array. So yes, I mean, there's probably better ways to do this. But again, it's just trying to have some relatively simple code. And this is also to prove the point that all we are doing is just outputting this sort of raw data from this PHP file that's being sent back to the HTML file that originally requested it. So this implies, because we're sending back data in XML format rather than just HTML format, that we have to modify also some of the code that receives and interprets this data as well. So let's take a look now to see how the JavaScript might have been changed by this code. So in this case, we'll see that quote is actually largely the same, but now what we're doing is, of course, using quote5.php instead of some of the other ones. We're still passing it the symbol, and this function then is essentially the same thing, but handler is where things get to be a little bit different. Notice that at the onset, one of the things that's very different about this is that we are using the getResponseXML, or rather the response XML field, rather than the response text field. And this is because as soon as the header type, the content type, was shown to be XML, then the XML HTTP request object knows that the data that was sent is actual XML data. So it treats it a little bit differently and puts it into this field, the response XML field, rather than the response text field, which is what you would get if the content type is text HTML, which is the default for the output of a PHP page. Okay, so now we are outputting XML, and we're going to treat this as an XML object. And in fact, JavaScript allows us, because XML is very similar to the structure of a DOM, we can actually use some of the pre-made constructs in JavaScript to allow us to pull this data out of it. So in this case, I want to get the prices, and notice that I'm getting out of the XML element, I'm getting get elements by tag name, and the tag that I want is called price. So in this case, you'll notice that we're performing, so let's take a look back at the XML. So this might make a little bit more sense, what we're doing here. Notice that we are navigating what is essentially another DOM. It's just a separate, it's probably inaccurate to call it that, but this is just an XML tree. It just has a whole bunch of elements that are rooted and nested like we would see in any typical XML file. So we see that we have these elements here. There's an element named price. And as you might know in XML, you could have more than one element that's called price. So maybe you return more than just one symbol at a time. So maybe you have multiple quote symbols and you have price for each one. Well, you can use JavaScript to figure out which one you want to get. So here what we're doing is we're telling in the XML object to get the elements by tag name. So keep in mind that this is plural. It's saying get elements, which implies that if there's more than one element, it will provide more than one element in this case. So this is what we have to test. If we find more than one element that's called prices, then we have to treat this a little bit differently. Now we know by default that we're returning just one price element, and so that's what we're testing for. We're checking to see if the length of the prices array, so because get elements by tag name will return an array of elements, we're finding the length of that to be 1. If it is, then we're going to update the price information that exists in our XHTML. So if we look at the XHTML that we have here, notice that we just have a couple of spans that we've given IDs to that we can then use to modify the inner HTML of these, just like we've seen for the other ones, but now we have multiple. So we can pick which one we want to modify and insert the data into it. So looking again at price up here, we can see that we are going to fetch the price information by getting the 0th element out of the prices array, and we will get from that element the first child and the node value. So basically what this looks like in memory is that we have an XML object that looks in text like this, but keep in mind that there is a root element that's called quote, and this has attached to it that attribute called symbol that has data of AAPL, but then it has 3 children associated with this. The first one is another XML object called price. Then we have another one that's called low and high, and then another one that's called low. And these elements have within them some text values. So notice that we have some constructs going on here. Let's see. So we have there's one child here, and it has a text value of whatever it was. It was like 300 something. 300 something. So what we're saying is that we're going to, when we are looking at this var prices, we're saying that we're setting this variable called prices equal to an array that have all of the elements that match this price thing. So that's what we're getting is this array right here. Or rather, it would be an array of multiple price elements if one existed. Now, there's only one price element in it, so we're getting that object, the 0th item, in this prices array. We're getting the first child of it, and we're getting the text value that's associated with that, or rather the node value that's associated with that object here, with this value. So this is returning to us the 300 something, and we can then insert that data using the inner HTML that references that one element ID. And so if we perform this test, or if we actually run this code like we saw, which was this, then we should see exactly what we had before. It's being a little bit slow, but hopefully it will come up soon. Let's see. Oh, there it is. Okay, 304.18, 302.20, so on and so forth. So just like we said, all of this data is being pulled using this slightly more complicated, but this does provide us a little bit more, we have a little bit more leeway with what we want to do with this. In other words, we can format a very complicated XML. This is a relatively simple XML file, as you know. We could create a relatively more complicated file, pull out whatever data we want, and put it into the appropriate place on the web page. And you'll notice that low and high are modified similarly. We just change all of the words from price to low and to high as is appropriate. Now, all of these tests are done within the handler function, which, as you know, we first have to test if the ready state changes 4, which means that the data has been loaded, and that we get an HTTP response of 200, which means that everything is A-OK. Of course, that is required. Otherwise, every time handler is run, we might get some strange results if we tried to perform this, because this data won't exist yet until these two conditions are true. OK, so let's move on now to our next one, Ajax 9. And now this one, you'll notice, is just a little bit different. And in this case, what we're doing is we're still receiving data, but what we are doing with it is that we're going to be using some more DOM elements to insert the data into the web page. So in this case, we're going to be using a new quote file, or no, just back to the original one, quote1.php. And so just to hammer home some of these ideas of the DOM, recall that quote1.php returned the data in just typical image, or rather text HTML. It was just the one piece of information, the price. So when we get that data, we can get that in the response text, and what we want to do, which is over here, and what we want to do is actually create, using some of these DOM methods, we actually want to create a new node and insert it into the DOM. Notice that down here, what we have is we have a div ID quotes, but there's no, we don't actually insert the data directly into this. We don't use inner HTML on this quotes div to modify or to add in the price that we saw. Instead, what we're doing is we're creating a new element. So in this case, we're creating a new element called a div, or a new element that is a div rather, and then we're creating a new text node that goes within that div, and that text node is given the text that was provided to us by quote1.php. Then what we do is we make text a child of that div, and then we take that whole thing and we actually append that to the node. So you notice that we are getting the, so just to put a diagram behind this, we have our DOM that is relatively complicated, where we have the root element is HTML, as you know. Then we have some children. One is the head. One is the body. Now we can continue creating the children to this by looking at what we have here. We can see that we have a form. So within the body, there is a form element. What I have to go to this. Let's see. I should move this up a little bit. So, all right, this is HTML up here. This is head over here. This is the body. Then a child to the body is the form. Then a child to this form is this div that's called quote. So I'm just going to call this quote, even though it's really an element of type div. And what we are doing up here is we're creating a new div. Then we're creating it as a child to that. And notice that this is completely separate from the DOM. We're creating another element of type text and providing into it the symbol and then the data that was given back to us. So 29.05 or something like that. Then we're making this text a child to that div. And then we're finding this element and we're telling it that we want this div to be a child of that. So we are basically just using these DOM functions to create additional elements and insert this data into the DOM directly, rather than having some pre-configured elements within the DOM that we would then modify. So again, this is an oversimplification of some of the cases that you might want to use this. But if you actually wanted to create multiple elements rather than having them predefined in HTML, this is how you can do it. You can create on the fly additional HTML elements and append them to the DOM in the appropriate place by using a method that looks like this. Okay? And in addition, this actually uses this anonymous function that I was telling you about earlier. Whereas before, what we'd done is we had defined a separate function called handler, and we set onReadyStateChange equal to handler. What's happening here is that we have onReadyStateChange that's up here. And what we're doing is we're setting it equal to an anonymous function. An anonymous function, if you're not familiar, is just a function without a name. But it doesn't need a name because the only place it's used is in this case, the onReadyStateChange. So all we need to do is just give it one function. We just need to give it this one anonymous function, and it will behave the same as if we had passed it a function name that existed elsewhere. So this is just this is sort of a neat thing that we can do in JavaScript that is, something that you should be aware of, that we don't have to use a named function in our XHR onReadyStateChange field. Any questions? Okay, moving on now. So in this one, what we're going to do is something even slightly different. So now we're going to be using a different data type altogether. So rather than use XML, there's another data type that exists that I would wager that you will probably use most often in Ajax. So rather than use XML, which, and I mean, XML is great, but like you just saw, it's also kind of a pain to have to navigate through. You have to go through this tree. It's just not very clean. It's possible, and it's nice if that's what you're comfortable with, but in my opinion, it's just not the cleanest way to do it. Now, there exists this other type of data that's used in JavaScript called JSON. JavaScript Object Notation. And JSON allows us to specify data in a very different way. So let's see. So realize that now you don't have to use just HTML or just XML to return data back from your PHP files to your Ajax HTML files. So we can use, of course, just raw HTML if you know that it's going to be simple enough to warrant it. You can use XML as well, and you can set the content type in your PHP file to be appropriate depending on whichever type you actually want to use. But the final one that you want to actually consider is JSON. And JSON is actually kind of neat. So this is, all right, so this looks a little bit confusing, but it's just a way to serialize data. And this is sort of the official specification for it. And it's basically just a nice way of taking an array, for example, and serializing it. And serializing it just means that you're collapsing it down into something that can be represented by a whole string of text. So you might have some array that's two-dimensional, for example, but using a JSON object, you can collapse it down into a one-dimensional array that's just represented by text. And JSON, actually, one of the reasons that it's so nice is that it's supported by a number of languages. Maybe not directly, but there are many libraries available for pretty much all of the major languages available today that allow you to take the constructs and take the data types that exist in these languages and convert them to a JSON-friendly object. And so some of these you might be familiar with, but the ones that we really care about are PHP. So PHP has some built-in functions that allow us to very easily create a JSON object based on just something that we already have. So we might already have like a PHP array, just as an example. We can easily take that and collapse it down into something that is very easy. So on the PHP end, you might use this function called JSON encode. And you pass into it just some variable, like an array, for example. And in this array could be an associative array, it could be a two-dimensional array, it really doesn't matter. Most data types in PHP can be JSON encoded and then sent back to your Ajax request, or to your Ajax page, and then you can do something with that data there. Now, the one aspect of this that gets a little bit hairy is that you have to use a function on the JavaScript end called eval. And eval is kind of dangerous just because what you're doing is you're taking whatever text was there and you're evaluating it. You're telling JavaScript to actually execute it as if it were code. And this, while it usually isn't that big of a deal for JSON objects, you might see why this could actually be a sort of a problem. Because if you actually took some code and it was just some arbitrary JavaScript code and you just told it that you wanted to evaluate it, you can obviously have a security hole within your application. So this is something to be mindful of, certainly. Now, when we have a JSON object, it actually looks something like this that's down here. Notice that what we have down here is basically just an array that has some keys and some values, and it's just given to us in this very simple format. So this is what a JSON object looks like. And so you can see that this is an array where we have some keys, price, high, and low, and we have some associated values with them. This price, 304.18, prices for high and low, respectively. So if we actually had a look at the quote file that was used to create this, you might imagine that this is actually going to be relatively simple. So what we have here is this data here. So we're taking the data from the CSV that was provided to us from Yahoo, and we're putting it into some variables. Then what we are doing is we're just going to output some of this raw JSON. So I mentioned that we have this JSON encode. That comes up in just a little bit, but you can, of course, just output the raw JSON that you want here. And this is just an object that can be represented very easily like this. Now this may look like just another sort of format that you can put your data in, but where this really becomes powerful is when you use this. Let's see, which one was it? Ajax? Nope. I forget now which one we were looking at. I hope it's this one. When you're actually looking at how we use this data, it actually becomes enormously easy, just unimaginably easy to retrieve the data that is available to us in this JSON object. So again, we have here an anonymous function for our onReady state change, and we get the response text that was passed back to us, and we evaluate it. And we put it within these parentheses to tell it that it's going to be an object. And as soon as this has been evaluated, what happens is that this quote variable right here becomes an object. And we can access all of the fields that were available from this JSON object from this quote variable right here. So what I can do is I can show, so I'm going to paste the actual JSON that we got back from the quote file here. But when I want to insert the raw data into an HTML form, it becomes very simple. So I can do what I've done before. I can create a whole bunch of DOM elements like this. But notice now that all I have to do to retrieve the price information is this right here. I can get the price from the quote object. And this is where it becomes really, really powerful and very easy, is that we had arbitrarily named this thing price, and just by evaluating it, we're saying that this object called quote has this value called price within it that holds this data that we wanted. There's no having to go through an XML tree or anything like that, no having to go through all of these various elements. We can just directly retrieve the data that is available to us using this dot notation. And what we see as a result is this right here. We can see that the price that we get from the symbol is here in this JSON object, and we use it when we created this DOM element or this DOM object and appended it to the DOM that exists right there. Okay, so finally, some of the last view that we have. Let's see how this is different. And it really would have been useful if I had implemented the loading GIF on all of these, I would say. Notice now that what we are doing here is slightly different, but ever only so slightly. We're still creating a DOM object, and we're putting our price into it. But again, the power here is that it's just very easy to pull the information out of this JSON object. But what is different slightly is the quote file that we're using. We're now going to be using quote 7, and quote 7 uses what I was referring to before, where we can create an arbitrary data type, like a struct, for example. Or we could even use an array if we wanted to, and we can use JSON to collapse this back down. And so in this way, we're mimicking the result of this JSON object in PHP. So in other words, what we're saying is that there's this class called stock. It has a couple of variables or a couple of fields available within it, the price, the high, and the low. And as you can imagine, I'm going to insert this data into the stock object. So I'm going to create a new instantiation of stock. I will add the stock price, the high price in the stock, and the low price in the stock. And what I'm going to do after all of that is use the JSON encode. Now keep in mind that you still have to print out the data. JSON encode just returns back a string that is the JSON encoded object. But this isn't too hard to deal with. You can just print out that information and be done with it. But JSON encode, as you saw from this Ajax 11, it gave us the string that looked just like a JSON object. And it added some additional quotes around the fields, but in essence, it's exactly the same thing. This is exactly what we saw before. We have these three fields, price, high, and low, and their associated data within them. So you can do this not only for arbitrary objects like classes, but you can also do this for arrays. So maybe you just want to use a simple array and use an associative array or a two-dimensional array to plug all of your data into it. You can still use JSON encode and get data very easily this way. Any questions? Now, it's important also to realize that we have to actually tell what the proper content type. So it's important to make sure that you set the appropriate content type at the top of your PHP file, whether it be text XML. If it's just regular text HTML, that doesn't matter too much. That's the default for PHP anyway. But if you're using JSON or XML, you should be sure to use the correct content type like you see here. So application JSON would be the appropriate one to use in this case. Any questions before we go on? Yes?
You had mentioned the extra quotes in the JSON encode.
Mm-hmm.
Is it handled the same, or are they stripped out?
It's handled the same. It's considered a string when you evaluate it. So in this case, it's all the difference really is just in the way that it appears to us. It doesn't matter if the quotes are there or not. It just makes it a little bit more clear what the name is. That it makes it a little bit more clear that price is a string, and that is a key, and that after the colon is a value 304.18. So this really is, I mean, this could be represented in a number of different ways. We could think of this just like a PHP array that has 3 keys, price, high, and low, and it has associated values after the colons here. The quotes in this case don't matter too much, but it's generally, I would say it's generally a good idea to put it around the strings like JSON encode would do. When we outputted it ourselves, it doesn't matter so much just because it's so simple. It's very simple of an object, and it doesn't really matter. Any other questions? Okay, so finally, Ajax 12. Now this really brings together everything that we have seen up until now. In other words, we know that we can instantiate the XML HTTP request object using all of these different methods, but we can also use some third-party frameworks to make our lives a little bit easier. And one of those frameworks is in fact YUI, which David really likes, and it's really nice of a framework because it abstracts us having to use all of these really complicated try-catch blocks when instantiating an XML HTTP request object. So this will look a little bit different, but we've essentially boiled this down to just a few lines of code in this case. So when we call quote, you'll notice that we've included a variety of YUI JavaScript files at the top, including the connection manager, YUI itself, and event. And basically, all we have to do is still to create our URL, which is very easy for us to do. It's the same thing that we've done before. We just concatenate the string of quote 7 together with the symbol itself. And then we tell Yahoo, or we tell YUI, that we want to perform an asynchronous request that is of type GET. So we're going to use a GET query. We're going to pass it the URL. And you'll notice that we're passing it. This is another JSON object. So in this curly braces, it represents a JSON object, and it has a key of success and a value of handler. So all this means is you can look at the YUI API and realize that one of these fields, success, requires a handler function to do something. So again, this is like that this onReady state change field that we saw in the other things, or in the other versions of this Ajax file. We can just pass it the handler function that we're going to be using. So this is all we need to do, and it performs the request for us. As soon as the data, or as soon as the state has changed at all, it will call the handler function, and we can retrieve the data from here. So in this case, notice that the difference now in this handler function is that it actually gets passed an object as a parameter, and we're just calling this object O, and this object has within it it's essentially that XHR equivalent that we saw before. So we can get the response text out of it, and we can evaluate the JSON object that was passed to us by quote 7, and we can insert the price very easily by just referencing quote.price, which is this the object that we got back, and it's that field called price with the value that's associated with it there. So using YUI, at least it shortens the code for us a little bit, but the other benefit is that they also make sure that it works on as many browsers as possible. So whereas we only were able to capture 2 major cases for the latest versions of IE and some of the more popular browsers, we would notice that this code would fail on older browsers. And so using a connection manager like YUI or some others like jQuery, there's a whole bunch of available frameworks and libraries that you can use. They basically just simplify this aspect for us, so we don't have to worry about all of these different connections. Now, if you decide to actually implement an Ajax page and you want to use a fancy little loading bar or a little spinny thing, there's some places, and it's sort of silly, but it's useful to have a repository of spinning bars and other little widgets that you can add to your page. You can find some of those here. So Ajax load and these, let's see, I actually haven't check this URL in a few months. So maybe, hopefully, at least one of these will work. But you might be able to find a good loading GIF in one of these URLs and use that in your Ajax page. So again, there's a variety of frameworks that are available to you: Dojo, jQuery, Prototype, YUI. You can use whichever one you like most. David finds YUI to be the most robust. Personally, I've used jQuery in a few projects of my own and found that to be preferable over YUI because I think it's sort of bloated. At least version 2 of YUI is. But you can pick whichever one you think will work best, and most of these have abstractions that allow you to do Ajax requests very, very easily. So we mentioned before that one of the prime examples of Ajax requests, or of Ajax in general, is Google Maps. And in fact, you will have to use Google Maps in an upcoming project, the one that will be released next week. And you'll notice that Google Maps actually has an API that allows you to embed a Google Map in your application and do something with it. So you might be able to perform a search. You can essentially recreate Google Maps using their API. And their API isn't all that difficult, but I thought I would just show you just something, sort of their introduction, just their very easy implementation of Google Maps, just so that you can see how to get started. And this uses, as you might know, a variety of JavaScript, some JavaScript code that allows you to load the map on a web page. So this is just a simple HTML file that has a few lines of code and a few lines of JavaScript and a little bit of XHTML, and you'll notice that we get, as a result, this Google Map. Now, there's been a couple of revisions of the Google Maps API. The latest is version 3, and it's actually pretty good these days, what they can do. But if we take a look at the code that is used to make up this page, we'll notice that it's actually not all that complicated. It's really just a few lines of code. Now, there's a couple of very important things that you should notice here. First of all, we have to actually include the API, and we do that with something that looks like this. We ask for the JavaScript file from Google Maps, and we include it in our own web page. And we have to, in order to initialize this Google Map on our page, we have to do a couple of things. So in this case, you'll notice that there's an initialize function that we've created where we create some objects and we pass in some data, some options that we want specific to this map, and we pass it to the Google Maps object as a whole. So we'll see here, let's see, so my latitude and longitude, this is just a variable, and we're creating a new latitude and longitude object that specifies where we want the center of this map to be. So latitude and longitude, as you know, is a way of finding a specific coordinate on the Earth. And if you have a good latitude and longitude, you can use that like as shown here. Now, if you have a couple of options, you can actually specify what zoom level you want it at. 8 is, as you can see, it's not particularly far zoomed in or out. It's just sort of a mid-range zoom level here. Let's see, some other options that we can set are the center, and we pass it a latitude and longitude object like you've seen up there, where we created a new one from the Google Maps lat_long method. And also we can give it the type of map that we want. So these are just a whole bunch of options that we can specify when creating a map. And finally, what we have to do is tell Google Maps to instantiate, excuse me, to instantiate a version of the map into a pre-existing div. And this is what's important. You'll notice that there's really not a lot of HTML going on here, but there is one thing. There's one div called a map canvas. And you can specify in CSS the size of this div to make the map an appropriate size on your web page so that it doesn't have to grow to be 100% of the browser size, as you see here, but maybe it's put off to the right, and so you have room for some forms on the left or what have you. You can do anything you want. You can style it with CSS, but as soon as you create this map, this map canvas ID, then you tell the Google Maps constructor that you want to use that element. So you pass it this element, and you also pass it the options that you had specified for this map. And in the end, it renders for you the Google Map inside that div with the options that you have specified. Now you might say, well, how do I know what options I want to use? Well, the Google Maps API actually comes with a lot of really good references. One of them is this link right here, the API reference, and in it you will find all of the options and methods that are available to you in Google Maps, and one of them is the map options. So map options here, we can see all of the properties and all of the descriptions and what type of data we can pass into it for all of the available options that exist in Google Maps. Now, I don't know a lot of information about the project, and I'm sure we'll go over it in a little bit more next week when it's actually released. But basically, what I think you'll be doing is essentially recreating a BART map. So BART is the San Francisco subway system, and they actually provide a lot of information to us in very easy XML form. So you can find out where all of the trains are at any given moment, for example. You can actually recreate the subway system on a map itself, and that's largely what you will be doing in combination with Google Maps and this XML data that will be provided by the BART system. And so this is a very Ajax-like application. In fact, it's called, we called this for a long time a mashup, which was a combination of two or more sources from various places. And mashups were very popular if you had, for example, if you had a Google Maps application that would show you all of the nearby Wi-Fi hotspots, for example. That might be a mashup of data that's from Google Maps, so showing you the map itself, and also the location data for all of these Wi-Fi hotspots. That's just one example. There's a variety of mashups that are available. And so you'll be creating your own mashup in Project 3, and it's certainly something that you should take into account and consider when working on your proposal for your final project. So with that, I thank you all for coming and listening, and we will see you next week.